Last week on Thursday Night Football, Kyle Pitts came out and had the biggest game in fantasy football for a tight end since the year 2000. That's absolutely insane. And I don't think we're going to get that type of a performance on Thursday Night Football this week, but I do think that we could get a very good performance from another unexpected tight end. The LA Rams and the Seattle Seahawks, and I'm going to list Colby Parkinson as a start this week on Thursday Night Football. Last week, I had Kyle Pitts as a fringe start, and I told everybody that he is likely the very first fringe that I would play, and he had top 5 upside. Then we ended up having him at tight end 6 last week. So hopefully, if you didn't have one of the studs on your team outside of Kyle Pitts, you ended up playing him. This week with Colby Parkinson, I'm going to put him as a potential top 12 candidate right off the bat, especially if Davante Adams doesn't play, which as of right now seems more than likely. Sean McVay won't rule him out, but I just can't see Davante Adams going out there after continuing to deal with a hamstring problem. The Rams are in the playoffs. Yes, they want the number 1 seed, but at the same expense, you don't want to lose Davante Adams for a significant time. Seattle is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. It's one area their defense has really struggled at this season. All over, their defense has been very good. Tight ends have been able to sneak in some fantasy points. Colby Parkinson now has back-to-back top 10 games and has been inside the top 10 in 5 of his last 6 games. He also has 6 touchdowns in his last 6 games as well. Finding the end zone this week with no Davante Adams definitely is a strong possibility. AJ Barner, Elijah Arroyo, neither of these guys have shown any type of consistency to try and run them out there on Thursday Night Football. The last thing you want to do is risk it with AJ Barner when we have several decent options this week and see a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or whatever it may be for the entire week, knowing that you made such a poor decision. I'll skip on both of these guys. We've got 2 Saturday games this week for the NFL. Philadelphia and Washington will be the first end of the doubleheader starting at 5 o'clock. And Dallas Goedert had 3 straight games outside the top 30 tight ends. He looked like he wasn't going to be fantasy viable for the rest of the season. And now he's got back-to-back weeks inside the top 8 tight ends. 2 touchdowns last week, over 70 receiving yards in each of the last 2 games. And this week, a great matchup against Washington, who's currently allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But you have to be careful with this one. Yes, I'm going to list him as a start, and I am going to hope, fingers crossed, that he can get his points early and often, because we might see a lot of what happened last week as well, where Philadelphia goes up big and then they end up kind of letting off in the second half. And if that happens, somebody is going to get screwed out of fantasy points this week for this team. The Eagles are allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, and with no Zach Ertz in Washington right now, it doesn't feel like they have somebody that is truly reliable at the tight end position. Ben Sinnott is definitely the one guy that you want to keep an eye on, maybe not for the rest of this year, but for his potential heading into next season. A former 2nd-round pick that is very good as an athlete at the tight end position. Maybe next year could be his breakout. The second half of the doubleheader on Saturday, Green Bay at Chicago, and this has some major playoff implications. Luke Musgrave has not shown any fantasy relevancy since Tucker Kraft went down with his injury, so we're going to completely skip over him. But for Chicago, Colston Loveland right now is going to be a start for me because the Bears could end up being without multiple wide receivers this week. Romo Odunze, Ben Johnson declined to say exactly what was going to happen, but when asked if Odunze was going to be shut down for the season, he responded with, anything is possible right now. Luther Burden is also banged up, and if these 2 guys both end up missing this game, Colston Loveland could end up being a huge target going up against Green Bay. Now, Cole Kmet could also make his way into the conversation if both guys miss, but as long as one of them miss, Colston Loveland is going to be a start for me no matter what. And it's going to be the big playability because there's probably not going to be a ton of targets going his way. But if he can average over 12 yards of reception, which he's done multiple times this year, he could still have a really solid day. Moving on to Sunday with Buffalo and Cleveland. And Buffalo's tight ends has some major question marks right now. Dalton Kincaid didn't do much of anything. He did score a touchdown in his return from injury the week prior, but last week he kind of disappeared. And all all of a sudden Dawson Knox is fantasy viable with back-to-back weeks as a top 7 tight end. In my opinion, Dalton Kincaid is still the guy to go after if you're shooting for a higher ceiling. Dawson Knox, I believe, could end up being a safer bet, but I do think that his floor is going to be a lot lower because he could just disappear at any point in time. Maybe Dalton Kincaid has slowly been working his way back. That is awesome, and maybe he's 100% this week. Maybe he hasn't been so far yet this season. Who would know, because teams just aren't being truthful. But I think both of these guys in this matchup against Cleveland, which is typically pretty tough on the outside, with a group of wide receivers that have not been consistent all year long, both of them could end up getting more than enough fantasy points to be worthy of a start in your lineup. Buffalo is allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends right now, and Harold Fannin is coming off of a week where he had 7 receptions, but he didn't really turn them into much of anything in terms of total yards. And this week, we could end up being without David Njoku once again. And if we are, Harold Fannin could end up seeing plenty of targets. He had 14 last week. But are they going to turn into anything in this matchup too? With it being such a tough matchup, I could see something very similar to last week, where he has 10 plus targets, where he catches 5 to 7 balls. But honestly, he could end up being under 50 receiving yards. So if you're playing Harold Fannin, you're playing him for a slightly lower floor and a much lower ceiling. But there's not a lot of tight ends that if David Njoku is out, that could receive more targets than Harold Fannin this week. The LA Chargers and the Dallas Cowboys, and Oronde Gadsden is going to be my clean it up tight end of the week because we need this guy to get it together and start putting together some big weeks. Last week was a step in the right direction. Gadsden ended up finishing as the tight end 15. Not a ton of upside, but he did have 61 receiving yards. But in the weeks prior to that, he was the tight end 52, 33, 21, and 31. Then he was the tight end 15. Then was those couple of games where it looked like he was going to absolutely go off and be a top 5 tight end the rest of the year. So what I mean to say is that it's been a while since Gadsden has been fantasy viable. Quentin Johnston ended up being out last week, and if he's out this week as well, then Oronde Gadsden could be a big target just like he was for Justin Herbert. And a matchup against Dallas where I wouldn't be shocked if they're going to have to throw the ball quite a bit to keep up with Dallas. It could end up being a back and forth affair for the entire game. LA's defense is super solid though, and if they shut down Dallas for any reason, maybe we don't see nearly as many passing yards as what we would like from Justin Herbert. And we are just over a week away from Christmas, and if you're still trying to finish your Christmas shopping, Harry's is here to help you out. Head on over to Harry's right now and check out the plethora of products that they have that you could wrap up to put under the tree or toss in the stocking for any of the loved ones in your life. And when you check out, use code HEADLINERS because you can get the Harry's Plus trial pack right now for only $10. It comes with a razor, it comes with a handle, and it comes with some shaving cream as well. So if you want to test the product out for yourself while getting a few gifts to go along with it, right now is exactly the time to do it. And the Harry's Plus blades are absolutely the best blades for the price right now on the market. So I highly encourage you to check them out. In fact, I'm definitely going to be cleaning up my face before I go and record wide receivers and quarterbacks for Wednesday. And for Dallas, Jake Ferguson is closer to being a sit to me than an actual start this week. The Chargers are allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and Jake Ferguson is very touchdown dependent right now. CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens are the main guys. Javonte Williams, if he's healthy this week, they're obviously going to be running the ball. But this is a really tough defense. Jake Ferguson could end up being the guy that they go to for some quick passing plays, but it may not turn into a ton of yards. So for me, Jake Ferguson is very, very touchdown dependent this week. For the first time in a long time, Travis Kelce is going to be without his boy Patrick Mahomes. And it's going to be interesting to see how the relationship with him and Gardner Minshew works out this week. I still think Travis Kelce has top 12 potential, but it is shaky top 12 potential. This is a guy that has been a solid start all year long, but without Patrick Mahomes, how well will they move the football? Can they get into the red zone to give Kelce a shot at a touchdown? And if he can't get a touchdown, does he have enough volume, good volume, from Gardner Minshew to make up for it with fantasy points? For me this week, we know that Minshew mania has been a thing in the past, and he has definitely played well in the NFL. but I don't know if it happens this week, and Travis Kelce could end up seeing a lower ceiling because of it. Kansas City is allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Gunnar Helm had a touchdown last week. Chig Oko, he continues to find himself right around 30 receiving yards weekly. But in this matchup against Kansas City, I'm going to go ahead and skip on both of them in the playoffs. Cincinnati and Miami is going to be a matchup of the two defenses giving up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So which tight ends are going to be the ones to own in this matchup? Miami is allowing the 2nd most fantasy points. Mike Gesicki is only a fringe start for me right now because a lot of this is going to hinge on T. Higgins. T. Higgins missed last week with a concussion. If he were to miss this week again while staying in the concussion protocol, then I think Mike Gesicki is the guy on this team with the most big play potential and the highest upside. But the problem is, will Noah Fant be back this week because he missed last week? Does he end up playing? You still have Tanner Hudson. You still have Drew Sample. So if you're trying to risk it with Mike Gesicki, it is going to be one of the bigger risk-reward matchups of the week for any tight end because Mike Gesicki could get you 0 points, maybe 1 or 2, but he could also get you 10 plus points as well. Darren Waller has to be a must start for me this week. If you don't own one of the top tight end options, and I mean one of the top like 3 guys, Darren Waller should probably be in your lineup. Scored 2 touchdowns last week, and we know this season that he has had touchdowns in bunches. And now he gets the defense that allows the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, the most touchdowns to opposing tight ends. Darren Waller could have a huge day. New York Jets, New Orleans Saints, Mason Taylor, he missed last week, still going to be questionable this week. Don't love the matchup though. New Orleans is allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. For Juwan Johnson, to me, he has a lower floor and a much lower ceiling right now. Chris Olave is getting a ton of targets. We know that. Vele is probably going to be questionable this week, but the question is also going to be at the running back position. So New Orleans could be missing a ton of people in this matchup, which if they are, they're going to have to throw the football. Juwan Johnson is going to be a guy that should get at least 6 targets, I would think, 4 to 6 targets at minimum. And if he does, that could end up being enough to give you probably 6 to 8 fantasy points. Going above double-digit fantasy points probably isn't in the cards. And that's where things will probably get frustrating for fantasy owners that are trying to roll with him. TJ Hawkinson could be coming on strong at the exact right moment. Now, if you play in a league that has more than 12 teams, I am talking about a deep league where the waivers have been picked clean all season long, TJ Hawkinson could be fantasy viable for you here late in the season. Over the last 3 games, in 2 of the games, he's had more than 50 receiving yards, 59 in one, 66 in another. The one game out of the last 3 games that he didn't do much in terms of receiving yards, he still scored a touchdown. So he's been the tight end 14, 14, and 13 over the last 3 weeks. JJ McCarthy on fire right now, playing very well, and he's utilizing his tight ends quite a bit to make that happen. TJ Hawkinson is awfully risky, but for those of you in deeper leagues, he could be worth a shot. Theo Johnson has to be a fringe start as well. He has lots of games where he could be a top 12 option. He has a lot of games where he could be outside the top 12. Unfortunately, there's not much consistency in this offense right now. And because of that, Theo Johnson is going to be on either end of the spectrum. If you decide to start him, you have to understand that you may get 0 to 2 fantasy points, but you also could get 10 plus fantasy points as well. Tampa Bay at Carolina, there's not going to be much to see in this matchup, and even if Cade Otton were to play this week after missing last week, I am not going to be one of those people playing him because they have gotten way healthier at the wide receiver position. Jalen McMillan, Tez Johnson, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Emeka Egbuka. That's where all the targets are going to go when Baker Mayfield passes the ball. Even if Cade Otton does play, he's probably not going to be one of the guys. And I know that Colt caught a touchdown pass last week, but even if Cade Otton plays, I'm not going to go out here and bank on maybe 3 or 4 targets and one of those being a touchdown. Carolina is a great matchup. Tampa Bay does allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Bryce Young is in a great situation this week as well, but neither of these guys have shown any type of consistency. And even in good matchups this year, they've done absolutely nothing. So I'm not going to risk it in the fantasy playoffs. If you would have told me last week that Trevor Lawrence would have thrown for 330 yards and 5 touchdowns, I would have told you that Brenton Strange was easily inside the top 5 tight ends. I probably would have bet my bank account on it, but this is 2025, where nothing makes sense. So instead, Brenton Strange had 1 catch for 26 yards. That's just how the season's going right now. Brenton Strange, it was a great position. T-Law played great last week. He just wasn't a part of the game plan, or T-Law just didn't see him for whatever reason. This week, he's definitely going to have to be risky, given the fact that last week with a ton of yards, he still didn't do anything. Evan Ingram has a great matchup. Jacksonville allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but Sean Payton doesn't care because he hates us, he hates fantasy football, and apparently he hates Evan Ingram, even though he talked about how awesome he was going to be in this offense all offseason. Atlanta at Arizona, and after just a huge, historic fantasy performance this past week, Kyle Pitts going up against Arizona, who allow the 8th most fantasy points per game, has to be a start once again. A really solid matchup, and what he's done over the last several weeks is really, really incredible. He needed Kirk Cousins. That's all that he needed. 30 targets total over the last 3 games. He's been the tight end 8, the tight end 8, and the tight end 1. For those of you that held on to Kyle Pitts all season waiting for something to happen, it was Kirk Cousins that finally unlocked him. Last week, Trey McBride had one of the toughest matchups in all of football going up against the Houston Texans. And people were asking me, Kyle, do we trust Trey McBride this week, or should we maybe look for somebody with more upside? There is not one person that I told last week to sit Trey McBride, regardless of who they had at the tight end position. Trey McBride said, oh, it's a tough matchup this week, hold my beer. He went and scored 2 touchdowns. This week going up against Atlanta, they allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. I don't care. If you own Trey McBride, he's in your lineup. For Pittsburgh at Detroit, I'm staying away from all of the tight ends here. Yeah, Pat Freiermuth at any point in time could have a solid day, but 3 for 45 is not what I'm looking for in the fantasy playoffs. Jonnu Smith hasn't done much of anything this year, but he got a rushing touchdown. Connor Hayward and Jonnu Smith had rushing touchdowns last week. They have 4 tight ends that they're utilizing at different times. Connor Hayward got 4 rushing attempts last week. Nothing really makes sense with how these tight ends are utilized, so I'm probably going to be staying away from all of them. For Detroit, it is a great matchup. Pittsburgh allows the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends. Shane Zylstra is their number 1 tight end right now, and him and no other tight end on this roster has done anything since Sam Laporta went down. Las Vegas and Houston, and last week Houston was inside the top 5 of fewest fantasy points per game allowed to opposing tight ends. Trey McBride came into town, took care of business, and now they're allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Brock Bowers, for me, is definitely risky because the quarterback play sucks. We don't know who's going to be the quarterback this week. It's a really tough defense, but we know that Brock Bowers is probably going to get 8+ targets. And when you do that at the tight end position, normally you got to roll with them. And I'd be willing to bet if you have Brock Bowers, you don't have many other options. For Dalton Schultz, right now Las Vegas allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and Dalton Schultz is very risk-reward this week. He could have a day like he had last week. He could also disappear because the wide receivers have such an easy matchup this week. Also, they have a very easy matchup on the ground, but we don't know what running back is going to be healthy either. So again, Dalton Schultz is one of those guys this week, like I've already mentioned with a couple of others. They are a fringe start, but they could get anywhere from 0 to 2 fantasy points, or they could go for double-digit fantasy points. Sunday Night Football, New England at Baltimore, and Hunter Henry, he tried to bring us back in a little bit, but like I've said, Hunter Henry's going to have a couple of games where he has huge games, and then he's going to completely disappear. Back-to-back weeks as a top 12 tight end, and then all the way down the tight end 38. Right now, Baltimore is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. They struggled at the beginning of the year, but they've been doing much better now against tight ends, and because of that, Hunter Henry definitely a sit for me. It's a solid matchup. New England allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Who are you going to risk it with, though? Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews were in an absolute banger of a situation last week, and Isaiah Likely didn't even get 1 target. It doesn't even make any sense. This is a guy that almost had a huge touchdown against Cincinnati a couple of weeks back, but unfortunately fumbled the ball. Then he scores a touchdown the week after, and then last week it seems like, hey, Isaiah Likely, great opportunity for him to go off once again, and he doesn't even get looked at. if we're going to roll with anyone in this matchup, if you want to risk it with anyone in this matchup, I'd risk it with Mark Andrews, and I still don't feel great about that. Monday Night Football, we have two of the better tight ends so far this fantasy season. George Kittle, since Brock Purdy came back, has been an absolute huge target in this lineup. And once again, for you fantasy owners out there, yes, that you had to deal with an injury, but since the injury, George Kittle has absolutely been going off for you, and he's going off at the exact right time. Indianapolis allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Kittle could be in for another big week. Tyler Warren with a down week last week. And just like last week, there are going to be concerns about Phillip Rivers at quarterback. Now, we do know that it is going to be Rivers this week. And the hope is that he can look to Tyler Warren a little bit more often. If you own him, you're probably starting him. There are not many guys that I will risk it with in the fantasy playoffs over Tyler Warren. Unless you have a Trey McBride, a George Kittle. I would go with even like a Darren Waller this week over a guy like Tyler Warren. When you start talking about like Colby Parkinson or Tyler Warren, that is where things could get really difficult for me. So probably you're starting Tyler Warren this week. If you have another option, let me know down in the comments. We'll try to figure it out together. Headliner Nation, there's my analysis for every matchup of the week at the tight end position. And hopefully tight end is one of your stronger positions right now because it has actually been very good for quite a while this season. And that's a great breath of fresh air given the fact that tight end has been awful for several years in a row. Do me a favor, hit the like button on the way out, subscribe to the channel, bell notification, comment, hype the video, whatever it may be. Please interact with the video and some way, shape, or form so YouTube knows that you appreciate the content that we're putting out. Stay safe, stay healthy. I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.